Before Afghanistan was a country, before it was a battlefield, before it was a headline repeated on global news for decades, it was something far older and far more powerful. It was a crossroads. Not a quiet crossroads, but one carved by tectonic violence and shaped by human movement for tens of thousands of years. The Hindu Kush Mountains rise like a jagged spine through the heart of the land, brutal and magnificent, dividing north from south, shaping climate, shaping trade, shaping war, shaping identity. These mountains are not simply geography, they are destiny. They have protected, isolated, and exposed this land all at once. Through their narrow passes, entire civilizations have marched, believing they were conquering the edge of the world, only to discover they had stepped into its center. Long before the name Afghanistan existed, long before the word Afghan carried political meaning, human beings were already surviving here. Archaeological evidence suggests that Paleolithic communities lived in northern regions more than 50,000 years ago. In caves and open-air sites, stone tools remain as quiet testimony that this land has never been empty. It has always been inhabited, always been used, always been part of a larger human story. By the Bronze Age, around 3000 BC, northern Afghanistan was home to sophisticated settlements connected to what scholars now call the Bactrias-Margiana archaeological complex. These were not primitive villages, they were fortified centers of trade and ritual. They traded lapis lazuli, the deep celestial blue stone mined in Badakhshan, to Mesopotamia and Egypt. Think about that for a moment. Stone from Afghan mountains decorating the tombs of Egyptian pharaohs. Even in antiquity, Afghanistan was connected to the wider world. The land sat between civilizations to the west, Mesopotamia and later Persia, to the east, the Indus Valley, to the north, the Great Eurasian Steppe, to the south, routes that would one day lead toward the Indian subcontinent. It was never isolated. It was never peripheral. It was always in between. And being in between is both a gift and a curse. It brings trade, culture, language, religion, and it also brings invasion. Around 2000 BC, Indo-Iranian tribes began migrating into the region. These pastoral, semi-nomadic peoples carried with them early Indo-European languages and belief systems that would shape much of Asia. From these cultures emerged early Iranian traditions, and possibly, within or near this region, the prophet Zoroaster. Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest monotheistic religions, may have taken root in these lands or in territories closely connected to them. Its ideas, cosmic struggle between good and evil, moral choice, judgment, would echo through later Abrahamic faiths. Fire temples may have burned in valleys that would centuries later hear the call to Islamic prayer. Afghanistan was already becoming a spiritual incubator, long before it was politically defined. By the 6th century BC, the Achaemenid Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great expanded eastward, incorporating regions such as Bactria, Arachosia, and Drangiana, areas that now lie within modern Afghanistan. These were not backwater provinces. Bactria in particular was wealthy and strategically vital. The Persian imperial system brought administrative order, taxation, road networks, and integration into one of the largest empires the world had yet seen. Afghan territories supplied soldiers and horses to Persian armies. They were woven into a structure that stretched from the Indus to the Mediterranean. For a time, the region was stabilized under imperial authority, but stability in this land is always temporary. In 330 BCE, the storm arrived. Alexander of Macedon defeated the Persian Empire and pushed relentlessly eastward. When he entered Bactria and Sogdiana, he likely expected another swift conquest. Instead, he found resistance unlike any he had faced. The terrain was unforgiving. The tribes were fiercely independent. Guerrilla tactics replaced conventional battle. A local leader named Spitamenes led a prolonged insurgency against the Macedonians, harassing their forces and proving that this land could not be subdued easily. Alexander eventually secured control, but not without difficulty, and not without adaptation. He married Roxana, a Bactrian noblewoman, a political union meant to legitimize his authority in the eyes of the local elite. Even the conqueror of the known world had to compromise in Afghanistan. After Alexander's death, his empire fractured, but Greek influence did not disappear. Instead, it evolved into the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, a Hellenistic state rooted deeply in Afghan soil. Here, something extraordinary happened. Cultures fused. Greek artistic realism blended with Eastern spirituality. Coins bore Greek inscriptions but circulated in Asian markets. This fusion would eventually help produce one of the most remarkable artistic traditions in history, Greco-Buddhist art, where the Buddha was depicted with Hellenistic features, draped in robes that resembled Greek sculpture. Afghanistan was not merely absorbing foreign culture, it was transforming it. By the 3rd century BCE, Buddhism had begun spreading into the region, especially after the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka embraced the faith and extended his influence westward. Monasteries were built, pilgrims traveled, traders carried ideas along caravan routes.
For nearly a millennium, Afghanistan would be one of the great centers of Buddhist civilization.
Massive statues were carved into cliffs, including the towering Buddhas of Bamiyan, which would stand for almost 1,500 years. Imagine the valleys then, monks walking dusty paths, prayer echoing against stone, silk caravans moving steadily along the arteries of the Silk Road. This land, now associated in modern consciousness almost exclusively with Islam and war, was once a beacon of Buddhist scholarship and artistic brilliance. In the 1st century CE, a new power rose, the Kushan Empire, founded by the Yuezhi people who migrated from Central Asia. Under King Kanishk, the Kushans created a vast empire stretching from Central Asia into northern India.
Their capital lay in Bactria.
Trade flourished along the Silk Road. Roman coins reached Afghan markets.
Chinese silk flowed westward. Indian philosophy moved north. Afghanistan became a commercial and cultural bridge between Rome, Persia, India, and China.
The Kushans patronized Buddhism heavily, supporting monastic institutions and artistic production.
It was a golden age, prosperous, cosmopolitan, dynamic, but geography ensures exposure.
After the Kushans declined in the 3rd century, the region once again became contested.
The Sasanian Persians reasserted control.
Later, the Hephthalites, known as the White Huns, swept into the region in the 5th century.
Cities were destroyed, power shifted, alliances formed and collapsed. Afghanistan entered another cycle of fragmentation and reconfiguration.
Yet each wave left something behind: genetic traces, linguistic shifts, artistic influences, architectural forms. The land became layered with civilizations, none fully erasing the one before. Then, in the 7th century, a new force emerged from Arabia.
Islam expanded rapidly after the death of Prophet Muhammad.
Arab armies defeated the Sasanian Empire and gradually pushed eastward.
The Islamization of Afghanistan was not immediate. It was not simple. Mountain strongholds resisted. Local rulers negotiated. Some regions converted quickly, others gradually over generations. But over time, Islam became dominant.
Persian language, now written in Arabic script, flourished as a cultural and literary medium. Afghanistan became part of the broader Islamic world, yet it retained its distinctive character, shaped by mountains and memory. By the 10th century, Afghanistan was no longer merely absorbing empires, it was producing them. From the city of Ghazni rose Mahmud of Ghazni, who expanded his rule into a vast empire and launched campaigns deep into the Indian subcontinent.
Ghazni became a center of wealth and scholarship. Persian culture thrived. Poets, scholars, theologians gathered in its courts.
Afghanistan was projecting power outward, shaping the political and cultural trajectory of South Asia.
The Mongols did not arrive like an army.
They arrived like the end of the world. In the early 13th century, word began spreading across Central Asia of a force unlike any before it, horsemen who moved faster than rumor, who showed no mercy, who erased cities so completely that even their names seemed to vanish from memory. At their head was Temujin, known to history as Genghis Khan. When conflict erupted between the Khwarezmian Empire and the Mongols in 1219, Afghanistan, then a vital part of that empire, became one of the main theaters of destruction. Cities that had flourished for centuries, Balkh, Herat, Ghazni, faced catastrophe. Chroniclers describe mass killings,
pyramids of skulls, irrigation systems destroyed, agricultural lands abandoned.
Whether the numbers were exaggerated or not, the impact was undeniable. Urban life collapsed in many regions. Trade routes were shattered. The Silk Road, once a lifeline of prosperity, became a corridor of fear. Bamiyan, once home to the towering Buddhas and a thriving Buddhist culture centuries earlier, resisted Mongol assault. In retaliation, Genghis Khan ordered its destruction after his grandson was killed during the siege. The city was annihilated. It was not simply conquered, it was erased. For Afghanistan, this was not just invasion, it was civilizational trauma, yet even Mongol devastation did not permanently silence the land. Over time, something remarkable happened: the conquerors became settlers. The Mongol rulers who established control over the region, particularly under the Ilkhanate and later Timurid influence, gradually adopted Persian culture and Islam. The blade gave way to bureaucracy. The fire gave way to architecture. By the 14th century, from the ruins of Mongol conquest emerged a new power, Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane. Claiming descent from the Mongols but deeply Persianized in culture, Timur launched campaigns that stretched from India to Anatolia. Afghanistan once again sat at the center of imperial ambition. Timur's capital was in Samarkand, but Herat in western Afghanistan became one of the jewels of his empire under his successors. In the 15th century, under the Timurid ruler Shah Rukh and his wife Gauhar Shad, Herat transformed into a radiant center of art, literature, and architecture.
Mosques rose with turquoise domes. Miniature painting flourished.
Persian poetry reached new heights.
Scholars gathered.
Libraries expanded. Herat became one of the cultural capitals of the Islamic world, Think about that transformation. Only a century earlier, the region had been devastated by Mongol invasion. Now it stood as a beacon of intellectual and artistic brilliance. Afghanistan's history is never linear, it is cyclical, regenerative. Destruction, then renaissance. But while culture blossomed in Herat, political fragmentation simmered beneath the surface. After Timur's death, his empire fractured among competing heirs. Power struggles weakened centralized authority. Into this vacuum stepped new forces rising from different directions. From the north came Uzbek tribes under Muhammad Shabani Khan, who seized much of Central Asia in the early 16th century. From the west rose the Safavid Empire in Persia, promoting Sharia Islam as state doctrine. And from the southeast, a Timurid prince named Zahir-ud-Din Muhammad Babur, born in Fergana, sought to reclaim lost territory. Babur briefly held Kabul in 1504 after losing his ancestral lands in Central Asia. Kabul became his base of operations. From there, in 1526, he launched an invasion into northern India, defeating the Delhi Sultanate at the First Battle of Panipat. This victory marked the foundation of the Mughal Empire. Afghanistan, once again, became a launching ground for a new empire. Under the Mughals, Kabul remained a significant provincial center. Babur himself loved the region deeply. He wrote fondly of its gardens, climate, and fruit in his memoir, the Baburnama. He is buried in Kabul, a testament to his attachment to the land. Yet Mughal control over Afghanistan was never absolute. The terrain resisted centralization. Tribal structures remained powerful. Pashtun tribes in particular maintained strong autonomy. Among them were the Ghilzai and Durrani confederations, names that would later shape the very birth of modern Afghanistan. By the 17th century, Afghanistan sat between two major powers, the Mughal Empire to the east and the Safavid Empire to the west. It was contested ground once more. Kandahar, strategically positioned, changed hands multiple times between Safavids and Mughals. Control of Kandahar meant control of trade routes and military access. In this constant tug-of-war, local Afghan tribes gained military experience and political leverage. They were no longer passive subjects of empires, they were power brokers. In the early 18th century, Safavid Persia weakened dramatically due to internal decay and external pressure. Sensing opportunity, a Ghilzai Pashtun leader named Mirwais Hotak led a revolt in Kandahar in 1709. He expelled Safavid authority and established an independent Afghan state. For the first time, an explicitly Afghan-led polity emerged in the region. After Mirwais' death, his son Mahmud Hotak went even further. In 1722, he invaded Persia and captured Isfahan, toppling the Safavid dynasty. For a brief, astonishing moment, Afghan rulers controlled much of Persia itself, but rapid expansion brought instability, internal divisions, logistical challenges, and resistance in Persia weakened Hotak rule. By 1730, the Afghans were expelled by a rising Persian military genius, Nader Shah. Nader Shah was relentless. In 1738, he captured Kandahar, Kabul, and Ghazni, reasserting Persian dominance over Afghan territories. He then marched into India, sacking Delhi in 1739 and carrying off immense treasure, including the Peacock Throne and the Kohinoor Diamond. Among Nader Shah's commanders was a young Afghan officer named Ahmad Khan Abdali. When Nader Shah was assassinated in 1747, his empire collapsed almost immediately. Power fragmented. In Kandahar, Afghan tribal leaders gathered in a traditional council known as a Loya Jirga. They selected Ahmad Khan Abdali as their leader. He took the title Ahmad Shah Durrani. This moment marks the birth of modern Afghanistan. Ahmad Shah Durrani is often called the father of the nation. He unified the Pashtun tribes under the Confederation and embarked on a series of military campaigns that expanded his rule dramatically. At its height, the Durrani Empire stretched from eastern Iran across Afghanistan into much of Pakistan and northern India. In 1761, Ahmad Shah defeated the Marathas at the Third Battle of Panipat, one of the largest battles of the 18th century, shaping the future political landscape of India. Yet despite these conquests, Ahmad Shah's greatest achievement was not expansion but unification. For the first time, a relatively cohesive Afghan political identity emerged. It was not a modern nation-state in the contemporary sense, but it was a recognizable Afghan kingdom rooted in tribal legitimacy. When Ahmad Shah died in 1772, succession struggles weakened the empire. His successors lacked his authority and military genius. Provincial governors gained autonomy. Internal rivalries intensified. The empire shrank gradually, particularly in India. By the early 19th century, Afghanistan had become a buffer zone between two expanding superpowers, the British Empire in India and the Russian Empire in Central Asia. The age of indigenous empire building was ending, the age of imperial rivalry was beginning. Afghanistan, once again, was about to become the center of a global power struggle, not because it was weak, but because it sat exactly where empires collided. The crossroads was becoming a chessboard, and the next century would test
whether the kingdom forged by Ahmad Shah Durrani could survive the ambitions of the most powerful empires on earth. By the dawn of the 19th century, Afghanistan stood at the edge of a new kind of storm. The age of swords and tribal empires was giving way to something colder, more calculating, more global. The British Empire, entrenched in India, was expanding its influence northward. The Russian Empire, moving steadily south through Central Asia, sought warm water access and strategic dominance. Between them lay Afghanistan, mountainous, fractured, fiercely independent, yet positioned exactly where both empires feared the other would advance. This was not simply geography. It was destiny. Historians would later call it the Great Game, a shadow war of espionage, diplomacy, and proxy conflict between Britain and Russia. But for Afghans, it was not a game at all. It was survival. After the death of Ahmad Shah Durrani, internal struggles had weakened the Afghan state. By the early 1800s, the once powerful Durrani Empire had fragmented. Regional rulers competed for authority. Tribal loyalties shifted. Central control from Kabul was fragile. Into this instability stepped Dost Muhammad Khan, a member of the Baratsai clan, who seized Kabul in 1826 and gradually consolidated power. Muhammad was pragmatic. He understood Afghanistan's precarious position. He sought recognition and alliances to secure his rule, first reaching toward the British in India. But British officials, suspicious and calculating, hesitated. When Dost Muhammad then opened channels with Russia and Persia, alarm bells rang in British India. To British strategists, even the possibility of Russian influence in Kabul was unacceptable. The idea of a Russian-backed Afghanistan threatening India haunted imperial imagination. In 1839, Britain made its move. The First Anglo-Afghan War began not as a defensive campaign but as an invasion designed to install a more compliant ruler. British forces marched through the Bolan Pass and advanced toward Kabul, reinstating Shah Shuja Durrani, a former ruler seen as more pliable. At first, the invasion appeared successful. Kabul fell. Dost Muhammad surrendered and was exiled to India. British officials believed they had secured Afghanistan, but they misunderstood the land and its people. British troops, confident and complacent, settled into Kabul. Their presence grew increasingly resented. Tribal leaders felt humiliated. Urban populations simmered. The cost of maintaining control rose. Then, in the winter of 1841, rebellion erupted. The uprising in Kabul was swift and brutal. British envoys were killed. Supply lines were cut. Negotiations failed. In January 1842, approximately 16,000 people, including soldiers, camp followers, women, and children, began retreating from Kabul toward Jalalabad under a promise of safe passage. They never made it. Through the snow-covered passes, Afghan fighters attacked relentlessly. The retreat turned into a massacre. By the time the column was annihilated near Gandham, only a single European survivor, Dr. William Britton, reached Jalalabad alive. The destruction of the retreating force stunned the British Empire. It was one of the most humiliating defeats in imperial history. Afghanistan had sent a message: it could not be occupied easily. The British returned later in 1842 with a punitive expedition, burning parts of Kabul before withdrawing. Muhammad eventually returned to power. The first round of the Great Game had ended, not with British domination, but with Afghan resilience, yet the strategic anxiety never disappeared. Over the next decades, Russia expanded steadily through Central Asia, capturing khanates and consolidating control southward. British paranoia deepened. In 1878, when a Russian diplomatic mission was welcomed in Kabul and a British mission was refused entry, Britain responded with force once again. The Second Anglo-Afghan War began. British forces invaded from multiple directions, advancing toward Kabul and Kandahar. This time, the campaign unfolded differently. Afghan resistance was fierce but fragmented. After heavy fighting, including the Battle of Maiwand in 1880, where Afghan forces led by Ayub Khan inflicted a severe defeat on the British, the war settled into negotiation. From this conflict emerged one of the most consequential figures in Afghan history, Abdur Rahman Khan. Installed as Emir in 1880 with British support, Abdur Rahman was tasked with stabilizing the country. He ruled with iron authority, earning the title the Iron Emir. His strategy was ruthless centralization. He crushed tribal revolts, relocated populations, and strengthened the state's grip over regions that had long operated autonomously. Modern Afghanistan's centralized political structure owes much to his methods, harsh as they were. But the most enduring legacy of this era was not internal, it was a line drawn on a map. In 1893, the Durand Line Agreement was signed between Abdur Rahman Khan and Sir Mortimer Durand, representing British India. The line demarcated the boundary between Afghanistan and British-controlled India. It cut directly through Pashtun tribal territories, dividing communities that had never recognized such borders. This artificial boundary would later become the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan and a source of tension lasting well into the 21st century. Afghanistan remained formally independent,
but its foreign policy was constrained by British influence. It was neither colony nor fully sovereign state, it was a buffer, and yet, beneath imperial maneuvering, Afghan society was slowly evolving. In the early 20th century, global change was accelerating.
The Ottoman Empire weakened.
World War I reshaped continents.
Empires trembled.
In 1919, after the assassination of Emir Habibullah Khan, his son Amanullah Khan seized power in Kabul. Amanullah was young, ambitious, and determined to break free from British control. He launched the Third Anglo-Afghan War in 1919, a short but symbolically powerful conflict.
Though militarily limited, it forced Britain to recognize Afghanistan's full independence in foreign affairs under the Treaty of Rawalpindi. For the first time in modern history, Afghanistan was fully sovereign in its external relations. Amanullah seized the moment. Inspired by reformers like Ataturk in Turkey, he pursued rapid modernization. He introduced a constitution, expanded education, promoted women's rights, discouraged forced marriage, and attempted to reduce tribal power in favor of centralized governance. Queen Soraya, his wife, became a symbol of reform, appearing unveiled in public and advocating for women's education. But change in Afghanistan has always been delicate. Reforms moved faster than society could absorb. Tribal leaders resisted. Conservative religious figures opposed Western-inspired modernization. Economic strains compounded unrest.
By 1929, rebellion forced Amanullah to abdicate and flee the country. His experiment had been bold and premature. After a brief period of chaos, Mohammad Nadir Shah took power, restoring a more cautious approach. Following his assassination in 1933, his son Mohammad Zahir Shah became king at just 19 years old. Zahir Shah would rule for 4 decades. Under his reign, Afghanistan experienced relative stability compared to the turmoil of previous centuries. During World War II, Afghanistan remained neutral, balancing carefully between powers. In the Cold War era, the country adopted a strategy of playing both sides, accepting aid from the Soviet Union and the United States without formally aligning with either. Infrastructure projects expanded. Roads, dams, universities were built. Kabul developed a cosmopolitan atmosphere in the 1960s. A new constitution in 1964 introduced limited democratic reforms, establishing a constitutional monarchy and allowing political parties to operate more openly. For a brief period, Afghanistan seemed poised for gradual, peaceful modernization. Students debated ideology at Kabul University.
Women entered professional fields.
Political movements, from Islamists to Marxists, gained traction in urban centers. But beneath the surface, tensions brewed, economic inequality persisted.
Rural areas felt disconnected from Kabul's reforms. Political factions competed intensely. The monarchy's reforms created space for dissent without fully stabilizing it.
In 1973, while Zahir Shah was abroad, his cousin and former Prime Minister Mohammad Daud Khan staged a bloodless coup, abolishing the monarchy and declaring Afghanistan a republic. The centuries-old royal lineage ended quietly, but the calm was deceptive. Daud sought modernization and independence from foreign influence, yet he leaned increasingly towards Soviet support. Meanwhile, Marxist factions within Afghanistan, particularly the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, gained strength. In April 1978, in what became known as the Saur Revolution, communist military officers overthrew and killed Daud Khan. Afghanistan had entered a new era, one defined not by tribal confederations or imperial buffers, but by ideological revolution. The monarchy was gone, the republic was gone. A socialist state now stood in Kabul, and the Cold War, which had hovered at Afghanistan's borders for decades, was about to move violently inside. The crossroads was no longer merely between empires, it was between ideologies, and the consequences would echo for generations. When the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan seized power in April 1978 during what became known as the Saur Revolution, they believed they were dragging the country into the modern world. In reality, they were pulling it into one of the bloodiest chapters in its history. The monarchy had already fallen 5 years earlier. Mohammad Daud Khan's republic had promised reform and independence, but his rule grew increasingly authoritarian. When communist officers loyal to the PDPA stormed the presidential palace and killed Daud along with members of his family, Afghanistan did not erupt immediately into chaos. At first, there were speeches,
promises, declarations of equality, land reform,
literacy campaigns, women's emancipation, and the end of feudal tribal dominance. But the revolution was built on fragile ground. The PDPA itself was divided into 2 rival factions, Khalq and Parkham. They shared Marxist ideology but distrusted one another deeply. Nur Muhammad Taraki, a Khalq leader, became head of state. Radical reforms were announced with breathtaking speed: land redistribution, the cancellation of bride price, expanded education for girls, suppression of tribal authority, restructuring of Islamic legal influence. On paper, these reforms resembled modernization. In practice, they collided violently with rural Afghanistan. Most Afghans lived in villages shaped by tribal hierarchy, religious tradition, and local autonomy. The government in Kabul was distant, unfamiliar, and increasingly aggressive. Literacy campaigns were sometimes enforced at gunpoint. Religious leaders were arrested. Tribal elders were sidelined. Land reform was poorly implemented and chaotic. Thousands were imprisoned. Executions began quietly and then escalated. Resistance spread. By late 1978, uprisings were erupting across provinces, not coordinated, not centralized, but widespread. What began as ideological reform was turning into civil war. Inside the ruling party, paranoia intensified. Taraki and his rival Hafizullah Amin maneuvered against one another. In September 1979, Amin overthrew and killed Taraki. The regime grew even more brutal. The countryside slipped further out of government control. To the north, the Soviet Union watched carefully. Moscow had supported the PDPA for years. Afghanistan bordered Soviet Central Asia. Instability there meant risk. But Soviet leaders were uneasy about Amin. They doubted his loyalty and feared the regime might collapse, potentially opening space for Western or Islamist influence. On December 24, 1979, Soviet forces crossed into Afghanistan. Within days, Soviet special forces stormed the Tajbek Palace in Kabul, killed Hafizullah Amin, and installed Babrek Karmal, a Parkam faction leader, as the new head of state. The Soviet-Afghan War had begun. For the Kremlin, the intervention was meant to stabilize a socialist ally. It was supposed to be swift, controlled, manageable. Instead, it became their Vietnam. Soviet troops quickly secured major cities and airfields. Tanks rolled through Kabul. Helicopters dominated the skies. But as foreign soldiers had learned for centuries before them, controlling cities was not the same as controlling Afghanistan. The resistance reorganized. Across the countryside, disparate rebel groups, soon collectively known as the Mujahideen, meaning those who struggled, took up arms. They were not unified. They were divided by ideology, ethnicity, tribal loyalty, and personal ambition. But they shared one goal: expel the foreign occupiers and overthrow the communist regime. The war that followed was brutal, grinding, and deeply personal. Soviet forces relied on heavy artillery, airstrikes, and mechanized assaults. Villages suspected of harboring rebels were bombed. Irrigation systems were destroyed. Landmines were scattered across farmland and mountain paths, silent killers that would maim civilians for decades to come. The Mujahideen relied on mobility. They knew the terrain intimately. They operated in small units, ambushing convoys, striking outposts, disappearing into mountain passes. The war was no longer just Afghan, it was global. The United States, seeing an opportunity to weaken its Cold War rival, began covertly supporting the Mujahideen through Pakistan's intelligence services. Saudi Arabia contributed funding. Weapons flowed in. Training camps emerged across the border. What began as a domestic uprising became an international proxy war. In 1986, the introduction of American-made Stinger missiles dramatically shifted the battlefield. Soviet helicopters, once nearly invincible, became vulnerable. The balance of air power tilted. Meanwhile, millions of Afghan civilians fled. By the mid-1980s, over 5 million refugees had crossed into Pakistan and Iran. Entire villages emptied. A generation grew up in refugee camps. Education fractured. Economies collapsed. Social structures were torn apart. Inside Afghanistan, daily life became survival. Kabul, heavily fortified, remained under government control, but rocket attacks became common. In rural provinces, the government often controlled district centers by day while rebels dominated surrounding countryside by night. The Soviet Union poured resources into the conflict, but morale declined. Casualties mounted. Coffins returned quietly to Soviet cities. International condemnation intensified. The war drained economic and political capital at a time when the Soviet system itself was weakening. By the mid-1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev recognized the war as a bleeding wound. Withdrawal became inevitable. In 1988, the Geneva Accords were signed, outlining a timetable for Soviet withdrawal. By February 1989, the last Soviet troops crossed the Friendship Bridge into Uzbekistan. After nearly a decade, the Red Army had left Afghanistan. But the war did not end. The Soviet-backed government in Kabul, now led by Mohammad Najibullah, surprisingly held on for several years. Najibullah attempted national reconciliation. He softened ideological rhetoric. He tried to broaden political inclusion, yet the Mujahideen factions remained divided but determined.
When Soviet financial support collapsed following the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991, Najibullah's regime began to crumble.
In 1992, Kabul fell to Mujahideen forces. Celebration quickly turned into fragmentation. The factions that had united against the Soviets now turned against one another. Kabul became a battleground between rival commanders Ghabuddin Hekmatyar, Burhanuddin Rabbani, Ahmad Shah Massoud, Abdul Rashid Dostum, and others. Alliances shifted rapidly. Artillery rained down on residential neighborhoods. Thousands of civilians were killed in internecine fighting. The capital, once relatively stable even during Soviet occupation, was reduced to rubble by factional war. For ordinary Afghans, the 1990s were not liberation, they were chaos. Lawlessness spread. Warlords carved out territories. Roadblocks multiplied. Kidnapping, looting, and extortion became common. The state dissolved. Out of this exhaustion emerged a new force. In the southern city of Kandahar in 1994, a movement formed among religious students, many educated in Pakistani madrasas under the leadership of a reclusive cleric named Mullah Muhammad Omar. They called themselves the Taliban, meaning students. Their message was simple: end corruption, disarm warlords, restore order, enforce Islamic law. In a land shattered by warlord infighting, that message resonated. The Taliban advanced rapidly. They disarmed militias, sometimes brutally. They imposed strict social codes. Women were barred from most education and employment. Public punishments were enforced. Music was banned. Cultural expression narrowed. But they also provided something that many Afghans desperately craved: stability. By 1996, the Taliban captured Kabul. Former President Najibullah, who had taken refuge in a UN compound, was dragged out, tortured, and executed. His body was hung publicly, a symbol that a new era had begun. The Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan was declared. Not all accepted Taliban rule. The Northern Alliance, led by figures such as Ahmad Shah Massoud, continued resistance in the north. Afghanistan was again divided, but this time under an Islamist regime that drew international scrutiny. Few countries recognized the Taliban government.
Human rights concerns grew.
Cultural destruction reached global attention in 2001 when the Taliban demolished the ancient Bamiyan Buddha's statues that had survived nearly 15 centuries. The world watched in shock, but Afghanistan was not isolated. Within its borders, a foreign militant named Osama bin Laden, leader of Al-Qaeda, had found sanctuary, and as the 20th century closed, events were already in motion that would pull Afghanistan once more into the center of global conflict. The mountains had seen empires come and go. Now they would witness something different, a war that would last longer than any foreign intervention before it. The crossroads was about to ignite again. By the late 1990s, Afghanistan had become both isolated and intensely significant at the same time. The Taliban controlled most of the country after capturing Kabul in 1996, enforcing their interpretation of Islamic law with rigid authority. Public executions took place in stadiums.
Women were largely barred from education and employment.
Music, television, photography, even kite flying in some areas, were banned. The Islamic Emirate promised order, and in many places it delivered security from warlord chaos, but it did so at the cost of personal freedoms and international recognition. Only 3 countries formally recognized the Taliban government: Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Much of the world kept its distance, uneasy about human rights abuses and the regime's extremism.
Yet Afghanistan's internal story was no longer entirely internal. Within its rugged borders, a network was growing that would change global history. Osama bin Laden had returned to Afghanistan in 1996 after being expelled from Sudan. He pledged allegiance to Mullah Omar and was granted sanctuary. Al-Qaeda established training camps across the country. Foreign fighters arrived. Militant ideology deepened. The Northern Alliance, led by Ahmad Shah Massoud and others, continued resisting Taliban rule from the north, but they were militarily outmatched and diplomatically isolated. In 2001, everything changed. On September 9, 2001, Ahmad Shah Massoud was assassinated by Al-Qaeda operatives posing as journalists. 2 days later, on September 11, coordinated terrorist attacks struck New York and Washington. Nearly 3,000 people were killed. The world shifted overnight. The United States demanded that the Taliban hand over Osama bin Laden and dismantle Al-Qaeda. The Taliban requested evidence and negotiations, but refused unconditional surrender. For Washington, the response was decisive. On October 7, 2001, the United States, supported by a coalition of allies, launched Operation Enduring Freedom. Airstrikes targeted Taliban positions, command centers, and Al-Qaeda camps. Simultaneously, CIA operatives and U.S. Special Forces worked alongside the Northern Alliance on the ground. The Taliban regime collapsed with surprising speed. By November, Kabul had fallen. Kandahar followed in December. Mullah Omar disappeared. Osama bin Laden fled toward the mountains of Tora Bara and eventually escaped into Pakistan.
The Islamic Emirate was dismantled, at least formally. Afghans in many urban areas experienced a sense of cautious hope. After decades of war, perhaps this was a new beginning. In December 2001, Afghan leaders gathered in Bonn, Germany, to establish a transitional political framework. Hamid Karzai was appointed head of an interim administration. A new constitution was drafted in 2004, creating the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan.
Elections were held. International aid flowed in.
NATO's International Security Assistance Force, ISAF, deployed to stabilize the country. Kabul began transforming rapidly.
New roads were paved. Schools reopened.
Millions of girls returned to classrooms.
Universities expanded. Media outlets emerged. Women entered parliament. Satellite dishes appeared on rooftops. Internet cafes opened.
Construction cranes reshaped skylines. For the first time in a generation, a new Afghan urban middle class began to form. Yet beneath the optimism, old patterns stirred. The Taliban had not vanished. They retreated across the border into Pakistan's tribal areas, regrouped, reorganized, and adapted. Insurgency began quietly around 2003 and intensified by 2005. Improvised explosive devices targeted convoys.
Assassinations increased.
Rural districts slipped from government control. Meanwhile, the new Afghan government faced its own structural weaknesses. Corruption spread rapidly. Powerful warlords, many rebranded as politicians, retained regional influence. International funds poured into ministries, but oversight was inconsistent.
Elections were marred by fraud accusations.
In rural provinces, the central government often remained distant and ineffective. For ordinary Afghans, life improved in some ways and stagnated in others.
Access to healthcare increased. Child mortality declined. Infrastructure expanded. Yet unemployment remained high.
Security deteriorated in large parts of the countryside. By 2009, the insurgency had become a full-scale war. The United States, under President Barack Obama, authorized a troop surge, sending tens of thousands of additional soldiers to Afghanistan.
Counterinsurgency strategy focused on protecting civilian populations while targeting militant networks.
Operations intensified in Helmand and Kandahar provinces, traditional Taliban strongholds. Battles were fierce.
Night raids increased.
Civilian casualties, caused by both insurgents and coalition forces, fueled resentment.
The line between combatant and civilian blurred in complex tribal landscapes.
The war dragged on. In 2011, U.S. forces located and killed Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, Pakistan. For many Americans, this symbolized justice and closure for 9/11.
But for Afghanistan, the conflict continued. Gradually, NATO began transitioning security responsibility to Afghan forces. The Afghan National Army and police expanded dramatically in size. Billions were spent on training and equipment.
Yet structural problems persisted: desertion rates, uneven training quality, reliance on foreign air support. In 2014, NATO formally ended its combat mission, shifting to an advisory role.
Afghan forces were now primarily responsible for security. The Taliban sensed opportunity.
They intensified offensives, capturing rural districts, briefly seizing provincial capitals, demonstrating resilience.
Meanwhile, a new threat emerged.
Islamic State Khorasan Province, ISIS,
a regional branch of ISIS, began operating in eastern Afghanistan, adding another layer of complexity.
Politically, Afghanistan struggled. The 2014 presidential election resulted in a disputed outcome between Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah, resolved only through a US-brokered power-sharing agreement. Governance remained fragile. Despite instability, millions of Afghans continued building lives, opening businesses, attending universities, creating art, working in civil society. A generation had grown up after 2001 with different expectations than their parents. For them, war was constant, but so was aspiration. Yet after nearly 2 decades, the longest war in American history weighed heavily on international patience. In 2020, the United States signed an agreement with the Taliban in Doha, Qatar. The deal outlined a timeline for foreign troop withdrawal in exchange for Taliban security assurances and intra-Afghan dialogue. The Afghan government itself was not a direct signatory, a detail that foreshadowed coming instability. As international forces began withdrawing in 2021, the balance shifted rapidly. District after district fell to Taliban control with astonishing speed. Afghan security forces, often unpaid, undersupplied, and demoralized, surrendered or retreated. Provincial capitals collapsed in succession. Negotiations failed to produce a stable transition. On August 15, 2021, the Taliban entered Kabul. President Ashraf Ghani fled the country. The Islamic Republic of Afghanistan dissolved almost overnight. Scenes of chaos unfolded at Kabul airport as thousands attempted to flee. Foreign embassies evacuated. 2 decades of political structure evaporated in days. The Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan was declared once again. For many Afghans, the moment was surreal, history repeating itself with terrifying speed.
For women, activists, journalists, and former government employees, fear intensified. Restrictions returned. Girls' secondary education was suspended in most provinces. Media tightened. Protests were dispersed. International recognition remained limited.
Economic crisis deepened as foreign aid halted and assets were frozen. Humanitarian needs surged, yet Afghanistan did not disappear. Markets still opened.
Farmers still worked fields. Families still gathered for meals. Children still played in alleyways. Life persisted beneath geopolitics. Across centuries, the pattern is unmistakable. Empires invade. Ideologies rise. Regimes collapse. Borders shift. Yet Afghanistan endures, not unchanged, but unbroken. From ancient crossroads of Silk Road caravans to battleground of the Cold War.
From birthplace of empires to arena of global counterterrorism, Afghanistan has never been merely a passive stage for foreign ambition. It has shaped those who entered it. It has absorbed and transformed them. The mountains remain as they always have, the silent witnesses to human certainty and human failure.
Kingdoms have declared permanence beneath their shadows.
Superpowers have promised decisive victory, none have stayed, and the story of Afghanistan continues not as a simple tale of war, but as a testament to resilience, complex, painful, unfinished, and profoundly human. When the Taliban entered Kabul on August 15, 2021, there were no dramatic final battles in the capital, no last stand at the presidential palace, no prolonged urban warfare. Instead, there was silence, the kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from sudden collapse. Within hours, checkpoints changed hands. White flags replaced the tricolor of the Islamic Republic.
Government ministries emptied. Police uniforms vanished.
The state that had existed for 20 years dissolved almost without resistance. For many Afghans, the speed was incomprehensible. How could an army of more than 300,000 personnel, trained and funded for 2 decades, disintegrate in weeks? How could provincial capitals fall in days?
The answer was not a single failure but an accumulation of them. Corruption that hollowed institutions from within.
Dependency on foreign air power. Fractured political leadership, uneven morale, deals negotiated quietly at local levels, and a Taliban movement that had spent years patiently embedding itself in rural networks. The Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan had returned, but this was not exactly the same Taliban that ruled from 1996 to 2001, nor was it entirely different. It was a movement shaped by 2 decades of insurgency, international pressure, and internal evolution, yet still rooted in the same ideological foundations. In the first weeks, Taliban spokesmen held press conferences promising amnesty for former officials, protection for journalists, and respect for women's rights within Islamic law. The language was cautious, calibrated for a global audience. Diplomats and analysts debated whether this signaled pragmatism or tactical messaging. On the ground, reality unfolded unevenly. Former soldiers and civil servants faced uncertainty.
Some went into hiding. Others registered with new authorities under assurances of safety. Reports of reprisals emerged in certain areas, denied by the Taliban leadership but persistent in local accounts. For women, the shift was immediate and personal. Secondary schools for girls were suspended in most provinces. Women working in government ministries were told to stay home until further notice. Dress codes tightened. Over months, these temporary measures solidified into policy. Universities imposed gender segregation. Female journalists disappeared from television screens. Travel restrictions increased. In March 2022, just as many schools prepared to reopen for older girls, the decision was abruptly reversed. Classrooms closed again. The announcement stunned families who had believed change was coming. For a generation of girls who had grown up attending school after 2001, the closure felt like a door slamming shut on the future. Yet Afghanistan is not a uniform society. In some rural areas, restrictions aligned with existing conservative norms. In others, particularly urban centers like Kabul, Herat, and Mazar-i-Sharif, the transformation was jarring. Young professionals who had built careers in media, civil society, or business found themselves navigating a new, uncertain landscape. Economically, the shock was severe. When the republic collapsed, billions of dollars in Afghan central bank assets held abroad were frozen. International aid, which had accounted for a significant portion of government expenditure, was suspended or redirected through humanitarian channels. Banks imposed withdrawal limits. The currency fluctuated sharply. Businesses struggled to pay employees. Poverty rates surged. Afghanistan, already fragile, tipped toward humanitarian crisis. Drought compounded hardship. food insecurity spread.
International organizations warned of potential famine conditions in some regions. Aid agencies negotiated cautiously with Taliban authorities to deliver assistance without conferring formal recognition. Diplomatically, the Taliban faced a dilemma.
They sought international legitimacy and economic normalization, yet their internal policies limited recognition. No country formally recognized the Islamic Emirate as Afghanistan's legitimate government.
Some states maintained embassies or diplomatic channels in Kabul, but recognition remained withheld. Regionally, neighbors recalibrated. Pakistan navigated complex ties, balancing security concerns with historic connections. Iran engaged pragmatically while managing refugee flows. China and Russia signaled cautious engagement,
emphasizing stability and counterterrorism.
Central Asian states fortified borders but pursued dialogue. Meanwhile, within Afghanistan, daily life adjusted, markets reopened.
Traffic returned to Kabul's streets. Civil servants, mostly men, resumed administrative functions. The Taliban re-established ministries, though many were staffed by figures drawn from religious networks rather than technocratic backgrounds.
The Ministry for the Propagation of Virtue and Prevention of Vice re-emerged, symbolizing continuity with the previous emirate. Security in urban areas, paradoxically, improved in certain respects.
Street crime declined. Checkpoints became predictable rather than factional.
For some Afghans exhausted by decades of warlordism and insurgency, the absence of large-scale fighting brought relief. But security is not only the absence of explosions. ISIS-K continued conducting deadly attacks, particularly targeting Shia communities in public spaces. Bombings at mosques and schools reminded Afghans that stability remained fragile. Protests emerged sporadically, often led by women demanding education and work rights.
Demonstrations were dispersed.
Activists were detained, sometimes briefly, sometimes longer. Civil society contracted under pressure. Media outlets struggled.
Many closed due to financial strain or regulatory pressure.
Journalists adapted to self-censorship. Cultural expression narrowed again, yet beneath visible politics, Afghan society continued in quieter forms.
Weddings were held. Poets wrote. Traders negotiated. Families gathered for evening tea.
Rural farmers planted crops in valleys that had seen armies for centuries. Children chased soccer balls in dusty courtyards. History in Afghanistan does not move as a clean break between eras. It overlaps. The young man who once studied engineering under the Republic might now sell goods in a market stall. The former soldier might farm his ancestral land. The former insurgent might now sit behind a government desk. Identities shift with regimes, but memory persists. The Taliban leadership faced internal tensions as well.
Some factions favored stricter enforcement of ideological purity.
Others recognized the necessity of economic pragmatism and external engagement. Governance required compromise, something insurgency never demands. Internationally, debate intensified over how to engage. Isolation risked worsening humanitarian crisis.
Recognition risked legitimizing restrictive policies. Human rights organizations documented conditions.
Regional powers pursued strategic interests. For ordinary Afghans, geopolitics often felt distant compared to immediate concerns: food prices, employment, schooling, healthcare. The question that lingered was not only whether the Taliban could maintain power, but what kind of state they intended to build.
Would the Islamic Emirate remain rigidly ideological, or would economic necessity push adaptation? Could Afghanistan stabilize without large-scale foreign military presence?
Would internal dissent grow or dissipate? Centuries earlier, Afghanistan had been the heart of Buddhist scholarship. Later, it became a seat of Islamic empires. It survived Mongol devastation, imperial rivalry, Cold War proxy war, civil collapse, global counter-terrorism campaigns. Each era left scars and layers. In 2021, many outside observers framed the Taliban's return as history repeating itself.
But Afghanistan in the 2020s is not the Afghanistan of 1996. A generation has experienced global connectivity. Urbanization has increased. Technology, even limited, has changed expectations. Even in villages, mobile phones connect families to broader conversations. The crossroads is still active. Afghanistan remains positioned between Central Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, and China's western frontier. Trade routes, ancient and modern, still pass nearby. Infrastructure projects are discussed. Regional alliances shift. But beyond strategy and policy, Afghanistan's story is human. It is the teacher who hides textbooks at home, the father calculating how to feed his children through winter, the former translator navigating asylum paperwork, The farmer watching clouds gather over drought-stricken fields. The young woman studying English secretly at night. The Taliban official attempting to govern a complex country with limited resources. History often portrays Afghanistan as battlefield or buffer zone, yet it has always been more than that. It is a society layered with memory of empire and invasion, of reform and reaction, of poetry and politics. The mountains that watched Alexander, the Mongols, the British, the Soviets, and the Americans now watch another chapter unfold. They do not choose sides. They endure, and Afghanistan, as it has for millennia, continues to exist at the intersection of ambition and resilience, a land shaped by conflict, yes, but also by continuity. The story is not finished. It never has been, it simply changes form. The war ended, but silence did not bring peace. When the guns finally fell quiet in late 1993, Abkhazia was no longer the same land it had been just a year earlier. Villages were scarred, cities stood hollowed, families were broken. The war between Abkhaz forces and Georgian troops had not simply redrawn military lines, it had redrawn lives. The fall of Sukhumi marked a decisive turning point. Georgian forces retreated, and tens of thousands of ethnic Georgians fled or were forced to leave. What remained was a land emptied in places, reshaped demographically, emotionally, politically, and yet, in the rubble of destroyed buildings and shattered identities, something else began to form. A state, not internationally recognized, not widely accepted, but internally fiercely real. In 1994, Abkhazia adopted a new constitution. It declared itself a sovereign state, the Republic of Abkhazia. Vladislav Ardzinba, who had been the wartime leader, became the first president. For Abkhaz society, Ardzinba was more than a politician. He was a symbol of survival, but survival and governance are two very different things. The war had devastated the economy. Infrastructure was broken. Trade routes were severed. The region was isolated. Georgia, refusing to accept Abkhazia's secession, imposed an economic blockade. The Commonwealth of Independent States, under pressure from Tbilisi, also supported restrictions. Abkhazia became a land cut off. Electricity was scarce. Industry collapsed. Tourism, once the jewel of the Black Sea coast, disappeared. The once famous resorts of Soviet elites became empty shells facing the sea, yet paradoxically, in isolation, identity hardened, Abkhaz language revival programs expanded. Schools emphasized national history. Cultural festivals re-emerged. Traditional dances and epics were not simply performances anymore, they were declarations. We are still here. But the conflict was not frozen. It simmered. In 1994, a ceasefire agreement was brokered in Moscow. Russian peacekeepers were deployed along the Inguri River, the de facto border between Abkhazia and Georgia. A UN observer mission was established. This arrangement created what would later be called a frozen conflict. No peace treaty. No recognition, no reintegration, no resolution. Georgia, under President Eduard Shevardnadze, insisted that Abkhazia remained an integral part of Georgia. Abkhazia insisted it had exercised its right to self-determination. Between these two narratives stood thousands of displaced people, especially ethnic Georgians from the Gali district. The Gali region became one of the most sensitive areas. Many Georgian residents attempted to return. Some did, but security was fragile. Armed groups operated in the forests. Incidents of violence continued through the late 1990s. In 1998, clashes erupted again in Gali. Abkhaz forces reasserted control. Another wave of displacement followed. The war had ended, but trauma had not. Meanwhile, internally, Abkhazia faced a difficult question. How do you build a state that most of the world says does not exist? The government functioned with limited resources. Salaries were irregular. Infrastructure reconstruction moved slowly. The economy relied heavily on small-scale agriculture, informal trade, and increasingly Russian support. Russia's role grew steadily. Initially positioned as mediator and peacekeeper, Moscow maintained influence over the region. Russian passports began to be distributed to Abkhaz residents in the early 2000s. This process, sometimes called passportization, had long-term consequences. It tied Abkhazia's population legally and economically to Russia. For some Abkhaz, this was pragmatic. Survival required connection. Isolation was suffocating. For others, it raised uncomfortable questions. Was independence slowly becoming dependence? In 2004, Abkhazia experienced a political crisis that revealed the tensions beneath the surface. Presidential elections were held after Ardzinba's health declined. The contest between Sergei Bagapsh and Raul Kajimba became fiercely disputed. Allegations of fraud and pressure emerged. Supporters of both candidates mobilized. For weeks, Abkhazia stood at the edge of internal conflict. It was a critical moment.
Would the young state fracture from within? Eventually, a compromise was reached.
Bagapsh became president, Jimba vice president.
It was an imperfect solution, but it prevented violence. And in that fragile compromise, something important happened. Abkhazia demonstrated that political competition could exist without war. The state, however unrecognized, had survived its first major internal test. Then came 2008. Tensions between Georgia and Russia had been escalating for years, particularly over South Ossetia, another breakaway region. In August 2008, war broke out between Georgia and Russia. The conflict was brief but intense. While the main fighting centered in South Ossetia, Abkhazia also became involved. Abkhaz forces moved to assert control over the Kotori Gorge, the last area within Abkhazia still held by Georgian forces. Within days, Georgian troops withdrew. The territorial division became complete. Then, on August 26, 2008, Russia formally recognized Abkhazia as an independent state. It was a moment of triumph for many in Sukhumi. Fireworks lit the sky. Crowds gathered. After 15 years of isolation, a major power had said the words Abkhaz leaders had waited to hear: "You are a country." But recognition came at a cost. Most of the international community condemned the move.
The United States, the European Union, and NATO reaffirmed support for Georgia's territorial integrity.
Only a small number of countries, including Nicaragua, Venezuela, and later a few others, joined Russia in recognition. Abkhazia had gained recognition, but it remained largely unrecognized. The years that followed deepened the partnership between Abkhazia and Russia.
Economic agreements were signed.
Russian investment flowed into infrastructure, pensions, and security structures. Russian tourists returned to the Black Sea coast. The abandoned sanatoriums slowly reopened, roads were repaired. The airport discussions resurfaced, yet dependence intensified. The Russian ruble became the primary currency. Russian border guards controlled parts of the frontier.
Defense agreements tied Abkhazia's security closely to Moscow.
Critics argued that sovereignty was becoming symbolic. Supporters argued that sovereignty without security is meaningless. And beneath these geopolitical debates lay ordinary lives. Young people in Abkhazia grew up in a state that few maps acknowledged. Their passports were valid in only a handful of countries.
Travel was complicated.
Opportunities were limited, yet identity was strong. Ask a young Abkhaz whether their country exists, and the answer would not hesitate. Existence is not always determined by recognition. Meanwhile, the demographic reality shaped politics. The population of Abkhazia remained far smaller than before the war.
Ethnic Abkhaz themselves were not an overwhelming majority.
Armenians, Russians, and returning Georgians formed significant communities. Managing this diversity required careful balance. Language laws, citizenship policies, property disputes. Each issue carried the weight of history. In 2014, political unrest resurfaced.
Protests led to the resignation of President Alexander Ankvab.
Raul Kajimba eventually returned to power through elections. Again, the young state demonstrated volatility, but also continuity. Elections occurred.
Governments changed.
Institutions persisted. Throughout the 2010s, Abkhazia navigated a delicate path, asserting independence rhetorically while deepening integration economically and militarily with Russia. For Georgia, the issue remained open. Tbilisi pursued a strategy of engagement without recognition. Programs were designed to reach residents of Abkhazia through trade, education, and healthcare initiatives, without legitimizing the de facto authorities. Bridges were proposed. Trust, however, was fragile. Generations had grown up separated by barbed wire and memory, and so Abkhazia entered the 2020s in a peculiar position: de facto independent, de jure contested, internally cohesive, externally limited. Its beaches once again filled with summer visitors, mostly Russian.
Its parliament debated laws. Its cultural festivals celebrated ancient epics of the Narts.
Its schools taught Abkhaz history as the story of endurance. But the unresolved questions lingered. Can a state remain indefinitely in partial recognition? Can identity sustain sovereignty without broad legitimacy? Can reconciliation ever occur without acknowledgement of suffering on all sides? Abkhazia's story after the war is not simply about geopolitics. It is about survival after trauma. It is about how small nations navigate great power politics. It is about the tension between gratitude and autonomy. And above all, it is about memory. Because memory in Abkhazia is not distant, the ruins still stand in places. The photographs of the war still hang in homes. The names of the fallen are still recited, yet children play in Sukhumi's parks again. Cafes overlook the Black Sea. Life continues. And perhaps that is the quietest, strongest declaration of all. Abkhazia exists, not only as a territory contested in diplomatic halls, but as a lived reality for those who wake each morning to its mountains and its sea. Its future remains uncertain, but its past has shaped a people who are accustomed to uncertainty. From empire to autonomy, from repression to revival, from war to fragile statehood, Abkhazia's journey is not finished. In the next episode, we will explore the deeper social fabric of modern Abkhazia, its culture, identity debates, generational divides, and the question that now defines its horizon: what does independence mean in the 21st century? Because history did not end with recognition. In many ways, it only began anew. When the fireworks of 2008 faded and the flags were folded away after recognition by Russia, Abkhazia did not wake up transformed into a normal state. Recognition had changed everything and nothing. On paper, Abkhazia was now recognized by a major power. In reality, it remained geographically small, diplomatically isolated, economically fragile, and politically entangled. But beneath diplomacy and treaties, another story was unfolding, a quieter one, a story about identity. Because once survival is secured, a deeper question emerges: who are we now? Abkhazia in the 2010s was not the war-torn land of the 1990s anymore. The streets of Sukhumi were alive again. Cafes lined the seafront promenade. Children rode bicycles past Soviet-era buildings still marked by bullets. Tourists, overwhelmingly from Russia, returned to the beaches that once hosted the Soviet elite. The war generation carried memory. The post-war generation carried ambiguity. For young Abkhaz born after 1993, the war was not a lived experience. It was a story told by parents, a chapter in textbooks, a solemn commemoration day. Their daily reality was different. They grew up in a state that called itself independent. They carried passports that few countries accepted. They used the Russian ruble. They watched Russian television. Many studied in Russian universities. Some served in security structures aligned closely with Moscow. And yet, they were taught from childhood, "You are Abkhaz." The Abkhaz language revival became one of the central pillars of post-war state building. Schools expanded Abkhaz language instruction. Universities promoted research into Abkhaz history and linguistics. Cultural institutions revived epics of the Nart sagas, mythic heroes deeply embedded in Caucasian folklore. Language was not just communication, it was survival. For a small ethnic group that had historically feared assimilation, first under Imperial Russia, then under Georgian Soviet policies, preserving the language became existential. But this revival faced challenges. Urban youth often preferred Russian in daily life. Social media, business, and higher education operated largely in Russian. Armenian and Russian minorities also formed significant parts of the population. Abkhazia was not ethnically uniform. The post-war demographic shift had reduced the Georgian population dramatically, but Armenians remained a strong presence, particularly in commerce. Russians formed a visible community. A portion of Georgians returned, especially in the Gali district, though under complex citizenship and residency arrangements. This diversity forced the young state to balance national revival with multi-ethnic governance. Citizenship laws became politically sensitive. Who qualifies as Abkhaz? Who qualifies as a citizen of Abkhazia? What rights do returnees have? Each answer carried historical weight. Meanwhile, economic dependency deepened. Russian financial assistance became the backbone of the Abkhaz budget. Pensions, infrastructure projects, salaries for public employees, many were supported by Moscow. Russian investment flowed into tourism, construction, and energy. The border with Russia functioned as Abkhazia's main economic lifeline. Trade with Georgia remained minimal and politically fraught. The Inguri River crossing became both a physical and symbolic divide. Families separated by the conflict crossed cautiously. Goods moved in limited quantities. Trust remained fragile. For Georgia, Abkhazia was occupied territory. For Abkhazia, Georgia remained a threat to sovereignty. For Russia, Abkhazia was a strategic ally on the Black Sea. In this triangle, Abkhazia navigated carefully. Leaders in Sukhumi emphasized sovereignty in speeches while signing agreements that increased Russian integration. Military cooperation agreements expanded. Joint security frameworks were established. Russian border guards remained present. Critics inside Abkhazia began asking uncomfortable questions. Is recognition worth dependency? Can sovereignty exist without economic independence? Are we becoming too integrated to choose our own future? These debates were not always loud, but they were persistent. In 2014, global geopolitics shifted dramatically with Russia's annexation of Crimea. Western sanctions against Moscow intensified. Relations between Russia and the West deteriorated sharply. Abkhazia felt these shifts indirectly. Russian economic strain affected subsidies. Investment slowed at times. The geopolitical climate hardened positions around recognition. Abkhazia was now firmly within Russia's sphere. There was little room for diplomatic flexibility. Internally, politics remained dynamic, sometimes volatile. protests were not rare. Leadership transitions occasionally came under public pressure. Unlike many post-conflict regions, Abkhazia developed a pattern of contested but competitive politics. Power shifted through elections and public mobilization rather than prolonged violence. This did not mean stability was guaranteed, rather, it revealed a political culture shaped by strong personalities, clan networks, war veterans, and public activism. Veterans of the 1992 to 1993 war remained influential in politics and society. Their legitimacy derived from sacrifice. Their memory of war-shaped policy positions, particularly toward Georgia, reconciliation remained emotionally distant. Official talks between Tbilisi and Sukhumi continued under international mediation frameworks in Geneva. Discussions addressed security guarantees, humanitarian issues, and incident prevention. But the core issue, status, remained untouched. Georgia would not recognize independence. Abkhazia would not accept reintegration. The conflict remained frozen in diplomacy, but alive in identity. Beyond politics, everyday life revealed quieter transformations. Tourism became the primary economic engine. Russian families filled Abkhaz resorts each summer. Beach umbrellas returned to the coastline. Private guest houses multiplied. Small cafes thrived during high season, but tourism created seasonal inequality. Winters were quiet. Jobs fluctuated. Infrastructure, though improved, still lagged behind modern standards. Young people faced a dilemma: stay and build a future in a small, partially recognized state, or leave for Moscow, Krasnodar, or further abroad. Many chose migration. Education opportunities abroad were limited by passport recognition. Russian universities became the primary path for higher studies. Some young Abkhaz built careers in Russia and never returned. Demography remained a sensitive issue. For a small nation historically afraid of disappearance, population decline carried existential anxiety. Government programs attempted to encourage higher birth rates and diaspora return. Outreach to the Abkhaz diaspora in Turkey and the Middle East continued. Though return migration was modest, identity remained central. Festivals celebrating traditional music, equestrian games, and folklore were not merely cultural events, they were reaffirmations. The Abkhaz code of honor, hospitality, and clan respect continued to shape social interactions. Elders retained authority in community decision-making. Family networks remained strong. Modernity arrived, but tradition persisted. Then came the 2020s. The global COVID-19 pandemic disrupted tourism dramatically. Borders tightened. Economic strain intensified. Like many small economies reliant on travel, Abkhazia felt the shock sharply. At the same time, political shifts in Georgia introduced renewed rhetoric about territorial integrity and engagement. But the deeper change came in 2022. When Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, this event reshaped the entire post-Soviet geopolitical landscape. Abkhazia, deeply tied to Russia, could not remain unaffected. Some Abkhaz citizens, holding Russian passports, were subject to mobilization discussions. Economic uncertainties increased. International isolation of Russia further limited Abkhazia's already narrow diplomatic space. The question of dependency resurfaced with greater urgency. If your main patron faces global sanctions and military strain, what happens to you? Yet open criticism remained limited. Security ties and economic necessity reinforced alignment. Abkhazia found itself again at the intersection of larger powers, much like in earlier centuries. Small nations often do. Despite these pressures, daily life did not pause. Weddings continued. Children went to school. Fishermen cast nets into the Black Sea. Farmers harvested citrus fruits in autumn. Orthodox churches held liturgies. Mosques in certain communities called the faithful to prayer. Abkhazia's identity was layered: Caucasian, post-Soviet, Orthodox Christian with Muslim minorities, rural yet coastal, traditional yet adapting. It was not easily categorized, and perhaps that was its defining feature. A land too small to ignore history, too complex to simplify. The future remains unwritten. Will Abkhazia gain broader international recognition? Will Georgia and Abkhazia find a path toward reconciliation without erasing narratives? Will economic diversification reduce dependency? Will younger generations redefine sovereignty beyond 20th century frameworks? No one can say. But what is clear is this: Abkhazia has endured empire, deportation, demographic engineering, war, isolation, recognition, and geopolitical entanglement. It has survived by adapting without surrendering its core identity. In the mountains above Sukhumi, ancient stone towers still stand against the wind. They have watched kingdoms rise and fall. They have witnessed Ottoman fleets, Russian imperial banners, Soviet commissars, and modern peacekeepers. they now watch a small state balancing between gratitude and autonomy, memory and future.
Abkhazia in the 21st century is not merely a frozen conflict.
It is a society negotiating what independence means when geography limits options and history refuses to fade, and perhaps that is the most human part of this story, because beyond flags and treaties, beyond recognition and denial, Abkhazia is made of people who wake each morning not to geopolitics, but to life. In the next episode, we will explore the deeper historical roots of Abkhaz identity stretching back to antiquity, tracing the myths, kingdoms, and cultural crossroads that shaped this resilient nation long before modern borders were drawn. Because to understand where Abkhazia is going, we must go even further back to where its story truly began. Long before flags, before treaties, before the word Abkhazia appeared in diplomatic disputes, this land already had a name in the memory of mountains. Before modern borders carved the Caucasus into contested lines, the eastern shore of the Black Sea was a crossroads, a meeting place of empires, myths, traders, warriors, and seafarers. To understand Abkhazia's modern identity, we must step far back, beyond Russia, beyond Georgia, beyond the Soviet Union, into antiquity, because Abkhazia's story did not begin in 1992, it did not begin in 1918, it did not even begin in the Middle Ages, it begins in legend. The Greeks called this coastline part of Colchis the mythical land of the Golden Fleece. In Greek mythology, Jason and the Argonauts sailed across the Black Sea in search of a magical fleece guarded in a distant kingdom. That kingdom was Colchis, located along the eastern Black Sea coast, a region that overlaps with modern western Georgia and Abkhazia. Whether myth or metaphor, the legend reveals something important. Even in antiquity, this coastline was known to the wider world. By the 6th century BC, Greek colonists established trading posts along the Black Sea. Among them was Dioscurias, a settlement near what is today Sukhumi. Dioscurias became a vibrant commercial hub. Greek merchants traded wine, olive oil, ceramics, and metal goods in exchange for timber, honey, wax, slaves, and local products from Caucasian tribes. The region was never fully Greek, it was a frontier, a cultural intersection where Hellenic traders met indigenous peoples. Among these indigenous groups were ancestors of today's Abkhaz and related Northwest Caucasian tribes. They were mountain dwellers, skilled horsemen, fiercely independent, organized into clans. Ancient Roman writers later described tribes of the region with names resembling and other ethnonyms that scholars connect to Proto-Abkhaz peoples. These tribes were not centralized kingdoms in the classical sense. They were confederations, fluid, shifting, resilient. Empires could trade with them. Empires could attempt to control them, but full domination of the Caucasus Mountains was never easy. By the 1st century BCE, Rome had expanded influence into the Black Sea region. After Pompey's eastern campaigns, Roman authority extended into Colchis. Dioscurias became Sebastopolis under Roman rule. Fortifications were built, garrisons stationed, trade routes secured, yet Rome's power was coastal and strategic. The mountains remained autonomous. The Roman Empire valued the region primarily for its strategic location, a buffer against northern tribes and a gateway to the Caucasus passes. Christianity reached the region during the late Roman and early Byzantine periods. By the 4th and 5th centuries, Christianity began spreading among local elites. Churches were constructed, bishops were appointed. The religious shift would have long-term consequences. It connected the region culturally to Byzantium, and Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, would shape Abkhazia profoundly. In the early medieval period, the tribes of Abashti and Apsali appear more clearly in historical sources. By the 6th century, Byzantine Emperor Justinian I sought to strengthen control over the eastern Black Sea. Fortresses were reinforced. Missionaries were supported, yet Byzantine influence was never absolute. Local rulers maneuvered between empires. To the south, the Sasanian Persians exerted pressure. To the north, steppe tribes moved unpredictably. The Caucasus was never isolated, it was contested space. Gradually, a more unified political structure emerged. By the 8th century, the Kingdom of Abkhazia had formed, centered around Anacopia and later Kutaisi. The Abkhazian kingdom expanded significantly. Its rulers consolidated territories along the Black Sea coast and into western Georgia. This was a defining era, because during the 8th to 10th centuries, the Abkhazian kingdom was not a marginal state, it was a regional power. Under King Leon II, the kingdom declared independence from Byzantine overlordship. The Abkhazian monarchy expanded eastward, integrating neighboring Georgian-speaking regions. Over time, the Abkhazian kingdom merged dynastically with Eastern Georgian polities. This fusion eventually contributed to the formation of the unified Kingdom of Georgia in the 11th century under King Bagrat III. Here, history becomes politically sensitive in modern times. Georgian historiography emphasizes the unification process as the formation of a Georgian medieval state. Abkhaz narratives emphasize the foundational role of the Abkhazian kingdom in that unification. Both perspectives draw from the same medieval
medieval events, interpretation differs, but what remains clear is this: Abkhazia was not peripheral in medieval Caucasian politics.
It was central. During the height of the unified Georgian kingdom in the 12th to 13th centuries, under rulers like Queen Tamar, the region experienced relative prosperity, trade flourished,
monasteries thrived,
cultural life expanded, yet the Mongol invasions of the 13th century destabilized the Caucasus profoundly. Fragmentation followed, local principalities regained autonomy. In Abkhazia, regional rulers navigated shifting allegiances. By the 15th century, the unified Georgian kingdom had fractured permanently into separate kingdoms and principalities. Abkhazia emerged as the Principality of Abkhazia, ruled by the Shurvashids dynasty. This dynasty would rule for centuries. But a new force was rising in the Black Sea: the Ottoman Empire. By the 16th century, Ottoman influence extended along the eastern Black Sea coast. Coastal fortresses were seized. Trade routes reoriented toward Istanbul. Islam gradually spread in parts of Abkhazia, particularly among elites and coastal populations. However, Islamization was uneven and incomplete. Many mountain communities retained Christian traditions. Others blended influences. Abkhazia became a frontier between Christian and Muslim spheres. Ottoman control was indirect. Local princes maintained authority while acknowledging Ottoman suzerainty. Slave trade increased during this era.
Caucasian captives were sold into Ottoman markets.
This dark chapter affected demographic patterns deeply, yet Abkhaz society remained clan-based and decentralized. The mountains continued to protect autonomy. In the 18th century, another empire approached: Russia. Following its expansion southward, the Russian Empire sought influence over the Caucasus. Orthodox Christian solidarity provided one diplomatic bridge. Some Abkhaz princes saw alliance with Russia as protection against Ottoman dominance. In 1810, the Principality of Abkhazia accepted Russian suzerainty. At first, autonomy was preserved, but gradually, imperial administration tightened control. By the mid-19th century, following the broader Caucasian War,
Russian policies reshaped the region dramatically.
The Caucasian War, 1817 to 1864, was one of the longest and most brutal conflicts in Russian imperial expansion. While Abkhazia was not the epicenter like Circassia or Chechnya, it was deeply affected. In 1864, after the final Russian victory in the Caucasus, mass deportations occurred. Large portions of the Muslim Abkhaz population were exiled to the Ottoman Empire. This event, known among Abkhaz as part of the Mohajirism, permanently altered demographics. Villages emptied, diaspora. Communities formed in modern-day Turkey, Syria, and Jordan. The population decline was severe, and into the vacated lands, new settlers arrived, including Mingrelians and other groups from neighboring regions. This demographic transformation would echo into the 20th century. By the late 19th century, Abkhazia was firmly integrated into the Russian Empire. Railways expanded.
Administrative reforms standardized governance.
Orthodox Christianity regained institutional presence, but Abkhaz identity did not disappear. It adapted. It survived empire. It survived religious shifts. It survived demographic upheaval. When the Russian Empire collapsed in 1917, the Caucasus entered chaos. Brief independence movements arose. The Democratic Republic of Georgia emerged in 1918, claiming Abkhazia within its borders. But internal instability and external Bolshevik pressures soon reshaped the region again. By 1921, the Red Army entered the Caucasus. Abkhazia was declared a Soviet Socialist Republic, at first in a special treaty relationship with the Georgian SSR. This unique status would later be downgraded, and the seeds of future conflict would quietly be planted. The ancient and medieval history of Abkhazia reveals something essential. This land has never been isolated. It has been Greek and Roman frontier, Byzantine ally, medieval kingdom, Ottoman frontier, Russian imperial province. Its people have navigated empire repeatedly. Adaptation became instinct, survival became culture, and perhaps this is why modern Abkhazia approaches sovereignty not as an abstract legal term, but as a deeply emotional inheritance. Because for a small nation shaped by displacement and demographic change, history is not distant, it is proof of endurance. The mountains still stand where ancient tribes once gathered. The Black Sea still reflects the same horizon Greek sailors once saw. Empires came and went, borders shifted, but the land, and the identity tied to it, persisted. In our final episode, we will bring all these threads together, from myth to monarchy, from empire to war, from recognition to uncertainty. We will ask the ultimate question: what is Abkhazia's place in the modern world, and what might its future hold? Because history is not only about what has happened, it is about what remains possible. There are countries that exist without question, and then there are countries that exist in question. Abkhazia belongs to the second category, not because its people doubt its existence, not because its institutions are imaginary, but because the world remains divided over how to see it. As our journey comes to an end, we return not to the past, but to the present. Because Abkhazia's greatest challenge is not what it has survived,
It is what it will become. Stand today on the promenade of Sukhumi, the Black Sea moves quietly, indifferent to politics. Palm trees sway in the wind. Soviet-era buildings, some restored, some still bearing the scars of war, line the coast. Russian tourists stroll past cafes. Elderly men play chess in shaded parks. Children laugh as if history never happened, and yet history is everywhere. In the abandoned parliament building, burned during the 1992-1993 war, in the demographic reality of emptied villages, in the diaspora communities in Turkey who still remember forced exile from the 19th century, Abkhazia is layered time, ancient kingdom, imperial frontier, Soviet republic, war-torn breakaway region, partially recognized state, each layer still visible beneath the next. After Russia recognized Abkhazia in 2008, the region entered a new phase. For the first time since the war, a major global power declared it independent. But recognition did not automatically bring prosperity. It did not bring widespread diplomatic acceptance. It did not open the doors of the United Nations. Instead, Abkhazia entered a paradox: recognized but largely isolated, independent but economically dependent, sovereign but strategically aligned. Russia became not only its primary ally, but its financial lifeline. Military cooperation agreements deepened. Infrastructure projects were funded by Moscow. The Russian ruble became the practical currency of daily life. For many Abkhaz citizens, this partnership felt natural. Russia had intervened decisively in 2008. Russia provided pensions, investment, and security guarantees, but over time, a quiet debate emerged inside Abkhazia itself. How close is too close? Can a small state maintain true sovereignty when its budget depends heavily on a single patron? These questions do not always appear in headlines. They are discussed in homes, universities, and among young professionals who look at the wider world through the internet, a world where Abkhazia appears on some maps and disappears on others. Georgia, meanwhile, never relinquished its claim. From Tbilisi's perspective, Abkhazia remains internationally recognized as part of Georgia's sovereign territory. Georgian governments have pursued a strategy sometimes called engagement without recognition. They offer humanitarian programs, trade initiatives, healthcare access, without formally acknowledging Abkhazia's independence. Diplomatic talks continue under international mediation in Geneva. Security incidents are managed through hotlines. But the core question remains frozen: status. And status is not a technical issue. It is emotional, historical, identity-based. For Georgians displaced from Abkhazia in the 1990s, return remains a deeply personal issue. For Abkhaz who fought for independence, reintegration feels like erasure of sacrifice. Between these two memories lies a gulf wider than the Inguri River. Inside Abkhazia, society continues to evolve. A new generation has grown up without direct memory of the war. They are digital natives. They follow global trends. They watch international films, study abroad, often in Russia, and return with broader perspectives. Some envision economic diversification beyond tourism and Russian subsidies. Agriculture, energy transit potential, niche trade routes, possibilities exist. Though constrained by political realities, tourism remains the economic backbone. Each summer, Russian families fill the beaches of Patsunda and Gagra. Resorts slowly modernize. Private entrepreneurs renovate Soviet sanatoriums. But tourism alone cannot secure long-term prosperity. Infrastructure requires modernization. Investment requires stability and legal clarity. International business hesitates in disputed territories, so Abkhazia stands at an economic crossroads. Dependence offers short-term security, diversification offers long-term resilience, but requires political breakthroughs. Demography is another quiet concern. Abkhazia's population remains small. The war dramatically reduced numbers. Diaspora communities in Turkey and the Middle East maintain cultural ties, but large-scale return migration has been limited. For a nation historically conscious of survival, demographic balance is not abstract, it is existential. Language revival remains central. The Abkhaz language, part of the Northwest Caucasian linguistic family, is preserved through education and cultural initiatives. Festivals celebrate traditional music, equestrian games, and oral epics. Identity here is not simply national, it is ancestral. The mountains are not just geography, they are witnesses. They have seen Greek traders arrive in ancient Dioscurias. They have watched the medieval kingdom of Abkhazia expand under King Leon II. They have endured Ottoman influence and Russian imperial campaigns. They have seen Soviet commissars and post-Soviet soldiers. Empires shift, mountains remain. But the 2020s introduced new uncertainties. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed economic fragility. Tourism halted abruptly. Revenues declined. Then, in 2022, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine reshaped global geopolitics. As Russia faced sanctions and international isolation,
Abkhazia's dependency became more complex. When your main ally confronts global pressure, your own economic and diplomatic room narrows. Abkhazia did not initiate these global events, yet, like many small regions tied to larger powers, it absorbs their consequences, and still, daily life continues, weddings are celebrated.
Markets open each morning, fishermen return at dawn with their catch, university lectures debate history and law, political rallies demand reforms, opposition voices criticize leaders, presidents resign under pressure.
Elections are contested. Abkhazia is not static. It is not simply a frozen conflict. It is a functioning society navigating incomplete recognition. So what does the future hold? There are several possible paths. One path is gradual normalization within its current alignment, deepening integration with Russia while strengthening internal governance. This path prioritizes stability and security, even if broader international recognition remains unlikely in the near term. Another path imagines eventual negotiated settlement with Georgia, perhaps through confederation models, shared sovereignty, or innovative diplomatic frameworks. Such solutions would require extraordinary political courage on both sides, and deep reconciliation processes acknowledging trauma. A third path envisions broader geopolitical transformation. History has shown that international systems change,
alliances shift, recognition politics evolve. What seems frozen for decades can thaw unexpectedly, but any path forward will require confronting history honestly. Reconciliation does not mean forgetting, it means acknowledging suffering on all sides. The 19th century deportations, the Soviet demographic engineering, the war of the 1990s, the displacement of tens of thousands, these are not footnotes, they are living memory. Perhaps Abkhazia's greatest strength is resilience. Few regions have experienced such repeated imperial transitions and demographic upheavals while maintaining a coherent cultural identity. Resilience does not guarantee prosperity, but it ensures survival, and survival, for a small nation in the Caucasus, has always been the first victory. As we conclude this journey, we return to where we began, not in modern politics, but in landscape. The Black Sea horizon has not changed in thousands of years. Greek sailors once looked upon it in search of mythic treasure. Medieval kings guarded it as strategic coastline. Soviet elites vacationed along its shores. Soldiers defended it in war. Today, it reflects the sky just the same. Abkhazia's story is not finished. It is suspended between recognition and rejection, autonomy and dependency, memory and possibility. But perhaps that is the defining feature of this land. It has always lived between worlds, between empire and mountain, between coast and interior, between myth and geopolitics. Its future will not be simple, but then again, its past never was, and yet it endures, not as a headline, not as a frozen line on a map, but as a lived place, with language, memory, and people who wake each morning beneath the Caucasus peaks and call it home. History may debate Abkhazia. Maps may color it differently, but its story, ancient, painful, resilient, continues, and like the sea against its shores, it will continue shaping itself long after diplomats leave the room.